Blood smelled exactly like old pennies. Aviation fuel smelled like a migraine. Those two scents battled for dominance inside the cramped fuselage of the battered transport helicopter as the SEAL commander screamed his question over the deafening gunfire. When Maren Vale finally rose to her feet, the silence inside the cabin was absolute. Sand scraped between her molars, a gritty reminder that she was still breathing. She lay pressed against the corrugated aluminum wall of the cargo bay, her knees drawn tightly to her chest as she tried to make herself as small as possible. The floor beneath her shook violently, rattling the marrow inside her bones. Outside, the world was tearing itself apart. The rhythmic, concussive pounding of heavy machine gun fire hammered against the aircraft's hull. It sounded less like gunfire and more like someone striking the side of a metal dumpster with a sledgehammer. Maren was not a hero. Not here. Here, she was only 58 kilograms of bruised ribs and dehydration, wrapped in a torn, oversized civilian mechanic's jumpsuit that reeked of sweat and fear. The extraction team was a ghost unit of Navy SEALs. They had broken down the door of her makeshift cell earlier and dragged her across 3 miles of urban sprawl to reach the extraction point. They believed she was a low-level intelligence asset, a desk officer who had been kidnapped after turning down the wrong street. Maren had never corrected them. Talking required saliva, and she had not had enough of that for far too long. Through the haze of dust filling the cabin, she watched the professionals work. They moved with terrifying mechanical precision. Commander Silas Rourke, the squad leader, stood like a massive shadow beside the open troop door. His rifle barked in short, controlled bursts. Beside him, a younger operator named Calder was bleeding from a shrapnel wound in his shoulder. Even so, he continued feeding ammunition belts into an M2400, his face fixed in an expression of bored concentration. They did not look like men fighting for their lives. They looked like men doing yard work. But everything was unraveling quickly. Their extraction aircraft was an aging, unmarked Mi-17 transport helicopter, probably purchased by the CIA, with a duffel bag full of untraceable cash. The aircraft was screaming. The twin turboshaft engines mounted above the cabin produced a piercing whine that made Maren's dental fillings ache. They should already have been airborne. Then the engine pitch changed. A sharp, sickening pop sliced through the roar, followed by the sound of plexiglass shattering. The heavy aircraft lurched violently sideways. Its right landing gear slammed into the cracked tarmac. Maren's head struck the bulkhead, and white-hot sparks burst across her vision. She tasted copper. Bile surged into her throat, hot and sour. She forced it back down and coughed violently into the collar of her filthy jumpsuit. "Pilot's hit!" Calder shouted. He abandoned his weapon and scrambled toward the cockpit. The chaos inside the cabin intensified. Rourke pulled away from the troop door, his face streaked with grease and someone else's blood. Acrid gray smoke began filling the cabin. It smelled of burning plastic and overheated electrical wiring. The scent immediately twisted Maren's stomach. It was the smell of a dying aircraft. Calder reappeared in the cockpit doorway. I was not dragging anyone behind him. He simply looked at Rourke, his eyes wide, and shook his head. One frantic gesture communicated everything. The pilot was dead. Machine gun fire intensified outside, tearing through the thin metal skin above their heads. Jagged beams of sunlight pierced the cabin through fresh bullet holes. Dust drifted lazily through the light, oblivious to the violence surrounding it. Rourke seized the radio handset hanging from the ceiling and shouted into it. The cable had been severed. It dangled uselessly through the smoke. He threw the handset aside, his massive chest rising and falling. The helicopter was a sitting target. Its rotors were still turning, beating the air with a slow, heavy rhythm, but they were producing no lift. They served only as a beacon, announcing the aircraft's position to every hostile fighter within a 10-mile radius. Maren's right knee began to tremble. The movement was violent and uncontrollable. She pressed one hand against her thigh, trying to force it still. Her heart was beating so quickly that it no longer felt like individual beats. It had become one continuous flutter inside her chest. She wanted to remain curled against the wall. She wanted the SEALs to solve the problem. They were the operators. They had the armor, the weapons, and the training. She was supposed to be the package. Packages did not drive the delivery truck. "Check the co-pilot's seat," Rourke shouted above the noise, his voice cracking under the strain. Empty, Calder yelled back. It was a single pilot operation. Rourke looked around the cabin. His eyes moved rapidly across his men, assessing each of them and searching for a miracle. They were shooters, medics, and breachers. They were not aviators. Another line of bullets tore through the tailboom. The aircraft screamed in protest. Their options were disappearing. An incoming rocket-propelled grenade could transform the cabin into a sealed metal coffin. Rourke gripped a support post and leaned toward the center of the cargo bay. When he spoke, his voice no longer sounded like a command. It sounded like desperation. He shouted loudly enough to cut through the dying engines and the incoming fire. "Can anyone fly this thing?" Marin stopped breathing. Smoke burned her eyes, filling them with tears. Her knees stopped trembling. A suffocating silence seemed to settle over her, muting the gunfire and the screaming machinery. She looked down at her hands. They were covered in dirt and dried blood. Her fingernails were cracked. They did not look like the hands of a pilot. They looked like the hands of a victim. Marin hated flying rotary-wing aircraft. She was a fixed-wing combat pilot, an A-10 Warthog jockey accustomed to armor-plated cockpits and forward momentum. Helicopters were unnatural. They did not want to fly. They simply beat the air into submission until it allowed them to leave the ground. But the controls of an Mi-17 were conventional enough. A-collective, acyclic, anti-torque pedals. Physics was still physics. Marin closed her eyes. She felt sick. The moment she stood up, she would become responsible. If she took the controls and they died, their deaths would belong to her. If she remained on the floor, they would certainly die. But it would not be her fault. It was a cowardly, miserable thought. She hated herself for having it. The fuselage groaned as another burst of gunfire struck the armor near the nose. Marin opened her eyes. She unfolded her legs and pressed her hands against the vibrating aluminum floor. Then she forced her battered body upright. No one moved. For a fraction of a moment, the entire cabin seemed to freeze. Even the surrounding noise of the firefight dissolved into distant static. Rourke stared at her, his jaw clenched and his icy blue eyes narrowing in complete disbelief. Calder stopped tightening a tourniquet around his wounded arm. The nylon strap hung loosely between his teeth. They looked at Marin the way someone might look at a dog that had suddenly begun solving algebra. She was a ghost, a battered, 5'5" civilian package with a black eye, a split lip, and clothing that looked as though it had been dragged through a lawnmower. She was not supposed to possess authority. She was cargo. "Sit down," Rourke ordered. His voice was flat and dangerously calm despite the chaos outside. He extended a thick, gloved hand to push her back toward the floor. "You're in shock." Marin slapped his hand away. The crack of her palm striking his tactical glove was sharp and unmistakable. Rourke blinked. For the first time, he looked genuinely stunned. "Get out of my way," Marin rasped. Her voice sounded like crushed gravel. Her throat was so dry that every word felt as though it were tearing the tissue apart. She did not wait for Rourke to move. She drove her shoulder into his chest and shoved past the enormous seal with leverage created by pure, concentrated adrenaline. Marin staggered toward the cockpit. Her boots slipped over spent brass casings rolling across the cargo deck. The smell reached her before she crossed the bulkhead. Copper, voided bowels, and the sharp chemical bite of raw hydraulic fluid. The dead pilot was slumped heavily against the left side cyclic. His headset hung at an angle, and the visor of his helmet was smeared with a thick, dark substance. A large caliber round had punched through the reinforced plexiglass canopy and destroyed most of his neck. Marin did not gag. The cynical, detached part of her mind, the part shaped by relentless training and combat, slammed a steel door over her emotions. She could not afford to see a human being. She saw only an obstruction. "Pull him out," she ordered without looking back. Calder appeared beside her. This time, he asked no questions. He seized the pilot's harness straps and pulled backward, dragging the body from the seat with a wet, sickening sound. Marin slid into the pilot's position. The seat was still warm. Its fabric was soaked with blood, which immediately seeped through her thin jumpsuit and pressed against her thighs. Her body shuddered in raw, involuntary rejection, but her hands were already moving. She seized the cyclic. It was slick. Marin wiped her right hand violently across her chest, smearing the dead pilot's blood into her jumpsuit until she could secure a dry grip. Her eyes swept over the instrument panel. It was a chaotic collection of analog gauges, Russian lettering, and cracked glass. Warning lights flashed in a frantic yellow sequence. Master caution. Hydraulic pressure low. Generator 2 offline. "Are you out of your mind?" Rourke shouted behind her. He leaned into the cockpit, his massive frame blocking what remained of the light. "You're a translator." "I lied," Marin muttered. Her eyes moved from the torque gauge to the rotor RPM indicator. The rotor speed was dropping. When the pilot died, his body had forced the collective downward, flattening the pitch of the blades. The engines were still operating, but they were starving for air. Marin wrapped her left hand around the collective lever. Her fingers found the throttle twist grip. Her right hand tightened around the cyclic. Her feet settled against the anti-torque pedals. The pedals felt heavy and sluggish. The hydraulic assistance was disappearing. "Hold on to something," she said. She did not shout. Her quiet voice carried deadly seriousness. Rourke realized she was not pretending. He turned toward the cargo bay. "Strap in! Brace!" Marin drew in a breath. The air tasted of cordite and iron. She twisted the throttle grip to its limit, forcing fuel into the turbines. The turboshaft engines screamed, producing a violent, high-pitched whine that threatened to shatter the remaining glass. The vibration traveled through Marin's spine and into the base of her skull. She pulled upward on the collective. The Mi-17 resisted. It groaned like an arthritic giant. Warning horns filled the cockpit with a continuous, obnoxious tone that drilled into her ears. "Come on, you ugly bastard," Marin whispered. Her lips pulled back from her teeth. She pulled harder. The landing gear scraped across the tarmac with the horrific shriek of tearing metal. The nose pitched violently upward as the wind caught the aircraft. The helicopter wallowed and drifted dangerously left toward a broken concrete wall. Marin drove her right leg into the pedal, fighting the heavy and unresponsive controls. Pain exploded inside her knee where it had been injured during her captivity. She ignored it. More bullets hammered against the underside of the aircraft. A spiderweb crack spread across the plexiglass directly in front of Marin's face. She did not flinch. She pushed the nose forward, exchanging altitude for airspeed. The heavy helicopter cleared the concrete wall by less than 3 feet. The landing gear caught a coil of razor wire and dragged it into the air. They were flying. It was ugly. It was agonizingly slow. The controls felt as though they had been buried in wet concrete. But they were flying. Behind her, Marin heard Rourke breathing heavily into a headset he had retrieved from the floor. He leaned forward until his face was only inches from her ear. "Who the hell are you?" he shouted over the rushing wind. Marin did not turn toward him. She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon as tracer rounds streaked past the nose like furious, glowing hornets. She adjusted her grip on the blood-slick cyclic and tightened her jaw. "Just the package," she said. Being airborne did not mean they were safe. It only meant they had farther to fall. The Mi-17 shuddered violently with every rotation of the main rotor. Each bone-rattling impact traveled through Marin's spine and settled at the base of her skull. The instrument panel resembled a display of catastrophic failures. The master caution light flashed an angry yellow, casting a sickly glow over the dead pilot's blood pooled inside the center console. Marin ignored the lights. Lights did not fly helicopters. Physics did. And physics was putting up a brutal fight. The hydraulic pressure gauge continued to fall. Its needle twitched as amber fluid escaped from a severed line somewhere above the cabin. Without hydraulic assistance, the flight controls were becoming dead weight. Pushing the cyclic forward felt like trying to move a parked car out of deep mud. Her biceps burned. Lactic acid flooded muscles that had been deprived of proper food and water for far too long. Wind screamed through the shattered canopy. It struck Marin's face with physical force and tore the breath from her lungs. The air smelled of scorched desert dust and burning oil. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear the grit from her eyes. Tears carved narrow paths through the dirt on her cheeks. "Vector!" Rourke shouted from the cockpit entrance. He braced his massive frame against the bulkhead to remain upright. "Where are you taking us?" "Away from the people shooting at us," Marin snapped, her voice cracking. She had no map. The digital navigation display had been destroyed, leaving behind a spiderweb of cracked glass and lifeless pixels. She was flying entirely under visual flight rules through terrain she knew only from satellite images memorized before her capture. "We need a heading," Rourke demanded, leaning closer. His tactical equipment smelled of sweat and burned gunpowder. "Rally point Delta is 0 Nini 0, 40 kilometers out. Can this piece of junk travel that far?" Marin glanced at the fuel gauge. The right tank was empty, probably punctured during takeoff. The fuel level in the left tank was dropping much faster than the normal consumption rate. They were leaking fuel. "Not a chance in hell," she grunted. She forced her entire upper body against the cyclic to bank the heavy helicopter around a rising ridgeline. The movement sent agony through her bruised ribs. "We barely have enough fuel to remain airborne. The turbines will run dry, and then we become an extremely heavy lawn dart. Find me somewhere flat." "Somewhere flat," Calder shouted from the rear. Hai had secured the tourniquet around his wounded arm and was bracing a sniper rifle against the frame of the open troop door. "We're over the Hindu Kush. Everything is rock and cliffs." "Then find me a flat rock," Marin shouted back. Any trace of professional courtesy had disappeared. She was not a hero. She was terrified. And terror was exhausting to sustain. Her hands cramped so severely that her fingers locked around the controls like claws. If she released them, she might not be able to open her hands enough to take control again. A sharp metallic ping suddenly echoed through the cabin. A loud hiss followed. "RPG!" Calder screamed from the rear, directly behind us and low. Marin did not look. She reacted. Muscle memory, forged through extensive combat experience inside an A-10 Warthog, took control. An A-10 was a flying tank, and my 17 was a flying school bus. Marin treated it like a tank anyway. She dropped the collective. The helicopter lost altitude instantly and fell like an anvil. Her stomach slammed into her throat. Behind her, someone struck the ceiling with a heavy grunt. A streak of white smoke tore across the shattered canopy, missing the rotor mast by less than 3 feet. The heat from the rocket's exhaust washed over Marin's face, burning the skin across her nose and cheeks. The projectile struck the cliff face 100 yards ahead and exploded, showering the valley with pulverized stone. Marin pulled hard on the collective and demanded maximum torque from the engines, fighting to stop their fall before they struck the canyon floor. The turbine screamed in agony. Temperature gauges climbed into the red. Metal groaned throughout the aircraft. The rotor blades tore at the thin mountain air, struggling to find enough resistance. The helicopter stopped descending only 20 feet above a dry riverbed. Its landing gear brushed the tops of dead scrub. "Is everyone still breathing?" Marin gasped, her chest heaving. "Barely," Rourke grunted as he pulled himself from the cargo floor. He looked at her. The suspicion in his eyes had disappeared. In its place was a stark, practical realization. They were alive because of the bruised woman wearing the blood-soaked jumpsuit. Before Rourke could say anything else, the starboard engine backfired violently. A thick cloud of oily black smoke poured past the right side window. The sickening crunch of turbine blades tearing apart echoed through the cabin. The rotor warning horn began producing a single, continuous scream. "Engine 1 is gone," Marin said. Her voice became completely flat. The panic had burned away, leaving only cold mechanical necessity. "We're going down." Gravity stopped being an idea. It became an immediate and violent reality. With the starboard engine dead and trailing black smoke, the remaining port engine could no longer support the weight of the damaged transport. The Mi-17 began to sink. Slowly, heavily. "Brace," Marin screamed, tearing her throat raw. She had no time to search for an ideal landing area. The dry riverbed twisting through the canyon was covered with jagged boulders and deep channels carved by flash floods. It was a graveyard made of broken stone. She needed forward momentum. A helicopter without power did not glide. It fell. Their only chance was an auto-rotation. The air rushing upward through the rotor during the fall could keep the blades spinning, storing kinetic energy until the final instant. Then Marin could change the blade pitch and use that energy to soften the impact. The maneuver required absolute precision. Attempting it in an overweight Russian transport helicopter with dead hydraulics and half its canopy missing was practically suicidal. "Hold on!" Rourke shouted from the cargo bay, grabbing the webbing attached to the wall. The ground surged toward them. Gray stones expanded across Marin's vision, sharp and unforgiving. The wind screaming through the cockpit sounded almost human. "Wait," she told herself. Her left hand hovered over the collective, her knuckles white. "Wait! Wait!" At 50 feet, the ground became a blur. At 30 feet, she could see individual cracks in the rocks. "Now," Marin whispered. She pulled the collective upward into her armpit, releasing all the kinetic energy stored inside the rotor blades. The helicopter flared violently. Its nose pitched upward so sharply that Marin was thrown against the blood-soaked seat. The main rotor blades bit into the air, creating a powerful but temporary cushion of drag. Their descent slowed, but they were still falling too quickly, and the aircraft was drifting to the right. The tail boom struck first. A deafening crack tore through the canyon as the tail rotor hit a boulder. The entire rear section of the helicopter separated in an explosion of aluminum and fiberglass. Without the tail rotor to counter the torque from the operating engine, the fuselage began spinning violently to the left. Marin was thrown sideways. Her head struck the window frame. White flashes exploded behind her eyes. The main landing gear slammed into the riverbed. The metal buckled and collapsed immediately, driving the belly of the aircraft into the rocks. The impact was catastrophic. It felt as though a freight train had struck them from behind. Every bone in Marin's body compressed. Her teeth snapped together so violently that she bit completely through her lower lip. Warm copper filled her mouth. The helicopter slid across the jagged rocks, screaming like a dying animal and throwing a massive wave of dust and sparks into the air. It tilted dangerously, threatening to roll over and crush everyone beneath the spinning main rotor. Marin fought the cyclic. She drove her right foot against the pedal with all the strength remaining in her body, struggling to keep the aircraft level as it destroyed itself against the stones. Slowly and painfully, the mangled fuselage dragged to a stop. The last operating engine whined, sputtered, and died. Silence rushed into the wreckage. Heavy, ringing. It was not truly quiet. The metal air frame clicked and popped as it cooled. Fluids hissed as they dripped onto hot exhaust components. But after the deafening firefight and the screaming engines, the silence felt like the bottom of the ocean. Dust drifted through the shattered canopy, coating everything in a thin gray layer. Marin remained perfectly still. Her hands were locked around the controls in a death grip. She breathed in short, broken gasps. Her entire body trembled with the violent aftermath of adrenaline. She tasted dirt, blood, and aviation fuel. Slowly, she forced her fingers to release the cyclic. One by one, they peeled away, stiff and aching. Marin turned her head. Her neck cracked loudly. Inside the cargo bay, shadows began moving through the settling dust. Rourke released himself from the bulkhead. He looked battered. His tactical helmet sat crooked on his head, and a fresh cut sent blood down the side of his face. Calder lay on the floor, groaning and clutching his injured arm. But he was moving. Rourke stepped heavily across the debris and approached the cockpit. He no longer looked angry. He no longer looked commanding. He simply looked exhausted. He stopped at the threshold and stared down at Marin. She stared back, her chest rising and falling as blood dripped from her chin onto the collar of her filthy jumpsuit. Neither of them spoke. The rigid military divisions between rescuer and package, operator and civilian, had been destroyed somewhere during their desperate flight. Rourke reached into his tactical vest. He removed a battered olive-green plastic canteen, unscrewed the cap, and held it toward her. "You drink first," the SEAL commander said quietly. All the bravado had disappeared from his voice. Marin stared at the canteen. It was scratched and covered in dust. To her, it looked like the Holy Grail. She accepted it with a trembling hand and lifted it to her cracked, bleeding lips. The water was warm and carried a faint taste of plastic and iodine. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. "Thanks," she rasped, handing it back. Rourke took a drink, replaced the cap, and attached the canteen to his vest. He looked through the shattered canopy at the empty, rocky canyon surrounding them. They were deep inside hostile territory, miles from help, sitting inside a smoking wreck. Then he looked back at her. "So, A-10s?" Marin managed a weak, painfully uneven smile. "Warthogs, yeah." Rourke nodded slowly. Profound respect settled into his exhausted eyes. "Good to know. Now let's get out of here before this thing catches fire." If this gritty, white-knuckle crash landing left you breathless, hit the like button and share the story with a friend who loves intense, grounded military thrillers. Marin and the SEAL team survived the crash, but they are now stranded deep inside hostile territory without communications, and the enemy is closing in. What should they do next? Share your survival predictions in the comments below. Do not forget to subscribe and activate the notification bell so you never miss the next pulse-pounding chapter. Stay sharp out there.